You are not what you claim to be.
I am exactly what they said I was. Nothing more.
She is Cinderborn! Look! Oh my gods!
Is it true?
11 copper coins. That was the price on Wren's head the night the Alpha King bought her, and by the time he learned what he'd actually paid for, it would already be far, far too late to send her back. If you love dark romance where the secret always costs more than the person hiding it ever expected, subscribe, because a new confession posts here every day. Welcome to the Duke's Confession. I'm Duke Ashvale, and every night I bring you one more story of forced vows, buried secrets, and love that was never supposed to survive the truth. Settle in. Tonight's confession begins now. They called her Broken Wren, and the name was meant to be cruel, and it was, and it worked, because Wren had spent 3 years making sure everyone believed it. A wolf with no wolf, an omega with no shift, no bond scent, no worth on the mating block, except the little coin a desperate buyer might pay for a pair of hands in the kitchens. She had built that story out of silence and lowered eyes, one careful year at a time, and tonight it was about to be sold for 11 copper coins, and the promise that no one would ever look at her twice. She could not afford for anyone to look twice. Not after what her fire had done the last time someone did. The trading hall of Duskmare reeked of tallow smoke and old fear, same as always, and Wren kept her chin down and her hands loose, the way a broken thing holds itself. She had learned, over 3 seasons on this platform, exactly how much of herself to give away, and exactly how much to keep buried. And tonight, she gave away nothing at all. The auctioneer's gavel was already rising, when the whole hall went still, the way the air changes before a storm shows on the horizon. Alpha King Corvin Ashvale did not announce himself. He didn't need to. He was dressed plainly, no crown, no guards clearing a path before him, and that made him worse somehow. A man who didn't need the trappings to be obeyed, because obedience had simply always followed him, the way shadow follows a body in sunlight. His eyes swept the platform once, bored, and stopped on her, and did not move on. That one, he said. Beside him, a lean man in dark grey missed nothing. Lord Varek, the king's beater and oldest advisor, had the kind of eyes that priced a room before it finished walking into it, and when they landed on Wren, they narrowed a fraction, the way a man's eyes narrow at a sum that doesn't quite add up. Sire, Varek said quietly, she's kitchen stock, no shift on record. Why? 11 coppers, Corvin said. Was it? He had not stopped looking at her. Wren kept her eyes on the floor and thought, with distant horror, that of all the buyers in 3 years of careful invisibility, she had just been seen by the one man in the kingdom she could least afford to be seen by, and his advisor had already started wondering why. The carriage north was silent, and Wren was glad of it. She sat with her hands folded and did not look at the king across from her, and told herself this was no different from any other sale. A new kitchen, a new lie to maintain, nothing more. You haven't asked why I bought you, Corvin said, when the silence had stretched long enough, she'd almost believed he wouldn't. It isn't my place to ask, Your Majesty. No, but you wanted to. A pause. I find I am rarely wrong about people who are trying very hard to be invisible. Her pulse spiked so hard she was certain he could scent it. I have nothing to hide. I'm exactly what the auctioneer said. He didn't push further. He simply watched her the rest of the ride, the way a man watches a locked door he intends, eventually, to open. At the keep, Lord Varek met them at the gate, and his gaze went to Wren before it went to his king. The East Wing is being aired for you, sire, he said, and then, almost carelessly, has she been searched? House policy for new labor. She is not labor, Corvin said, already walking. She has rooms in the East Wing. Varek's eyes followed Wren all the way down the corridor and did not look away first. She felt it on her spine like a hand. That night, alone in rooms twice the size of the longhouse she'd grown up in, Wren pressed her back to the door and allowed herself, for exactly 1 minute, to shake. Then she stopped. Because shaking was a luxury a woman with her secret could not afford twice in the same day, and she had already spent hers on the auction platform. She avoided the king for 11 days. She avoided Varek longer than that, on instinct, the way a rabbit avoids the shadow of a hawk, without ever having seen one up close. It worked exactly as well as it had ever worked at Duskmere, which was to say, it worked until it very nearly didn't. She found the training yard empty at dawn, and let the smallest thread of heat gather in her palm, no bigger than a candle flame, just to breathe for 1 unguarded minute. She never heard him come. She only heard the boots scrape on stone behind her, and slammed her fist shut so fast the smoke curled between her fingers, and turned to find not the king, but Varek, standing very still in the archway, with an expression she could not read at all. "Interesting habit," he said, "for a woman with no shift. A trick of the light, my lord." He did not believe her. He did not say so either. He simply inclined his head and walked on, and Wren stood shaking in the empty yard, understanding for the first time that she had not merely been noticed by the king. She had been noticed by the one man in the keep, paid to notice everything, and paid, above all, to protect Corvin from exactly the kind of secret she was carrying. She wrote nothing down. She told no one. But that night, she barred her door for the first time since arriving, and did not sleep. The second scare came only 4 days later, and it frightened her worse, because it happened in her sleep, where she had no control over it at all. She dreamed of the longhouse burning, as she still did most weeks, and woke gasping to find the bedsheet beneath her hands smoking faintly at the edges, 2 small scorch marks already curling black into the linen. She spent an hour on her knees scrubbing the sheet with wet ash and lye until the marks were gone, heart hammering the whole time at every footstep in the corridor outside, certain each one belonged to Varek, come to collect his proof at last. It didn't, but she understood, kneeling there in the dark with her hands raw, that her fire did not need a witness to betray her. It only needed exhaustion, and grief, and a long enough night. The weeks that followed were, despite everything, the gentlest of Wren's life, and that gentleness was its own kind of danger, because it made her careless in small ways she couldn't afford. Corvin sought her out some evenings in the library, not asking anything of her, simply reading across the fire while she mended linens she didn't need to mend, and slowly, without either of them naming it, something warm began to grow in the space between their silences. There was a harvest feast in her 3rd month at the keep, the first grand gathering she'd been made to attend, and Corvin had asked, not commanded, asked, that she sit near him at the high table. She wore a borrowed gown the color of dark wine, and felt every eye in the hall on her, the way she'd once felt every eye on that auction platform, except this time, no one was pricing her. They were only curious, and curiosity, she was learning, was a different animal than contempt, though it still made her want to disappear. "You look as though you'd rather be anywhere else," Corvin murmured, leaning close enough that only she could hear it. "I am unused to being looked at kindly, Your Majesty. I don't yet know what to do with my hands." "Do nothing with them," he said. "Let them look. I intend to." And something in the way he said it, low and certain, made the heat rise in her chest that had nothing at all to do with her fire. Later, in the crush of dancing, a drunken lord jostled past her table and knocked a candle straight into her lap. Wren's whole body locked rigid, every instinct screaming to let the flame simply die against her skin the way it always had, rather than risk anyone seeing it do anything else. And for one terrible half-second, before she caught herself, warmth rushed to her palm instead of away from it, an old reflex to catch and hold rather than flinch. She smothered it against the tablecloth so fast that only a thread of smoke gave her away, and covered the movement with a laugh, brushing at her skirts as though only startled. "Are you burned?" Corvin asked, already reaching for her hand. "Only frightened, Your Majesty." She kept her palm turned carefully away from the candlelight as she said it. "Wax spooked me is all." He studied her a moment too long before he let it go, and across the hall, half hidden behind a pillar, Lord Varek's eyes had not moved from her table the entire time. The bond announced itself 2 weeks after the feast, on an ordinary afternoon, the two of them reaching for the same book at the same moment, his bare hand closing briefly over hers, and heat went through her so fast and so total that her vision blurred white at the edges, her wolf surging up from the place she'd kept it buried for 3 years, chanting one word against her ribs: "Mate. Mate. Mine." Corvin went rigid. He felt it too, exactly as it struck her, his jaw locking, his breath catching hard in his chest. For one long moment, his hand tightened on hers, as though he couldn't help it. Then he stepped back, and put the whole width of the room between them, and neither of them said a word about it, though the air in the library felt like it had caught fire in truth. She should have run that very night. She knew it even as she stayed. A bond that strong, discovered by a woman with a secret that strong, was a fuse burning at both ends at once, and she had no idea anymore which end would reach her first. Her own fire, or Varek's suspicion. It was Varek's suspicion that reached her first. She found him waiting outside her door 3 nights later, arms folded, patient as a man who has already decided how a conversation will end before it begins. "You've been in this house 3 months," he said. "No shift, no scent, no family anyone in Duskmere could name when I sent to ask. A habit of catching fire in empty rooms, and scorch marks on linens you scrub yourself instead of sending to the wash." He let that sit, and Wren's stomach dropped through the floor at how much he had already gathered, without her ever once seeing him look. "I have served the king since we were boys, Lady Wren, or whatever your name truly is. I read people for his safety. You are not what you claim to be." "I am exactly what the auction papers said," she said, and heard how thin it sounded even to her own ears. "Then you'll forgive an old soldier his suspicions," Varek said, "because I intend to have the papers checked against Duskmere's own registry within the week. If there's nothing to find, no harm will come of it." His eyes went cold. "But if there is something, my lady, I promise you I will find it, and I will bring it to him myself, in front of the whole court, so that he cannot be accused later of having been blind to it." He left her standing in the corridor with her heart slamming so hard she thought the whole keep must hear it. The registry search took the better part of a fortnight, and Wren spent every one of those days waiting for the axe to fall, unable to eat properly, unable to sleep beside the growing ache of a bond she could no longer pretend wasn't there. Corvin noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. That was precisely the trouble with him. "Something is wrong," he said, finding her sleepless in the west parlor near midnight, the fire down to embers. "You've been afraid for days. I feel it through the bond even when you say nothing. Tell me what it is." And she stood at the very edge of telling him herself, of setting the whole terrible weight down at his feet before Varek could do it for her, before it looked like exactly the kind of concealment that would make him doubt every gentle evening they'd shared. The words gathered at the back of her teeth. "My name isn't fully a lie, but what I am is. I carry a bloodline your own laws call a curse. I have hidden it since the night raiders burned my family alive around me, and your own beater is 3 days from proving it in front of your entire court." She opened her mouth. "Corvin," she began, and it was the first time she had ever used his name without a title, and she saw it land in him, saw something in his face open at the sound of it. And then she thought of her grandmother's warnings, of a bloodline burned 200 years ago for exactly this gift, of a king who might be bound by his own law to do the same to her the moment it was said aloud instead of confessed quietly between two people who trusted each other. and fear won, the way it always had. "I am only tired, Your Majesty," she finished instead. Truly, he did not believe her. She saw that too, saw the small flicker of hurt he tried to hide behind his usual stillness. But he let her go to bed, with the lie standing between them, and it was the last gentle night either of them would have for a long while. Varek brought it to the full court on the 13th day, exactly as he'd promised, exactly as coldly as he'd promised it. He had found no birth record for any Wren in Duskmere's registry, because there was none, because her family's true name had burned with them, and what he had found instead, buried in an old Border Patrol's report, was an account of a fire 3 years past that killed an entire pack in a single night, survived by no one according to the record, except that the report also noted, almost as an afterthought, a description of the one child pulled alive from the ashes by a passing patrol. Fire-flecked eyes, the same as Wren's. The hall filled slowly that morning, nobles gathering the way they always did when word traveled that something was about to break, and Wren felt every one of their eyes find her the moment she entered on Corvin's arm, the whispers rising before Varek had even spoken a word. She kept her chin level, and her hands folded, the way she had learned on 100 worse platforms than this one, and told herself she could survive being looked at, if nothing else. "She is Cinderborn," Varek announced, and the word landed in the hall like a dropped blade, echoing off the high stone. "A bloodline banned by your own great-grandfather's law, sire, hidden in your own house, in your own bed, and by the report's own dating, the sole survivor of a fire that by rights should have taken her with it 3 years past." The silence that followed was total. Somewhere near the back, a noblewoman gasped, quickly muffled. An older Lord Wren didn't know muttered something to his neighbor about the old laws, about what must be done, and she watched the words travel outward through the crowd like ripples on cold water, felt the whole room's fear curdling toward her, the way it always eventually did, no matter how gently a place first welcomed her in. Corvin rose from his throne slowly, and for the first time since the day he'd bought her, Wren watched something move across his face she could not read at all. Not disgust, not yet, but the particular stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew, in front of every noble house in his kingdom, with the law itself sitting heavy and undeniable in the room between them. "Is it true?" he asked her. Only that, not gently. And Wren, who had spent 3 years and 3 months learning exactly how to disappear, found she no longer had anywhere left to hide it. "Yes," she said, and let the fire rise in her open palm in front of the entire court, gold and trembling, and finally seen by everyone at once, instead of no one at all. "It's true. Do with me as your law demands, Your Majesty. I ask only that you remember, I never once used it to harm a single soul in this house." The silence stretched long enough that Wren believed, with a strange and total calm, that she already knew how it would end, and had made her peace with it, somewhere between the auction platform and this exact moment. "The law," Corvin said at last, and his voice carried to every corner of the silent hall, "was written by a king who feared a gift he never once troubled himself to understand. I have spent 3 months watching a woman flinch at shadows, hide her own hands, apologize for the crime of existing in my house, and I let myself believe it was only a servant's habit, because that was easier than asking what she was actually afraid of." His eyes did not leave her. "I am not my great-grandfather, Lord Varek." His gaze cut to his advisor, whose face had gone carefully, professionally blank. "Pull the border report in full, every page, every witness. I want to know who set that fire 3 years ago, and why a report that found a survivor was never once followed up in 3 years by anyone in this kingdom's service." It took the better part of a month, and it was Varek himself, methodical to the last, and clearly relieved to have somewhere honest to point his suspicion now. Who found it? A merchant lord named Halric, still comfortably titled 2 counties over, who had paid raiders to clear a rival pack's land, and never once imagined a child would crawl out of the ashes to grow into a woman who'd end up standing in a king's own court with his own crest on her collar. The proof was quiet and total, a paid raider's confession, a steward too frightened to keep lying once pressed, and Halric was stripped of his lands and his title within the season, dragged out of the same court that had once nearly condemned Wren in his place. Varek himself came to her afterward, an apology plain and unpolished on his face. "I did what I believed my duty required," he said. "I will not pretend otherwise, but I am glad, Lady Wren, to have been wrong about what kind of danger you were." "You were only doing your work, my lord," she said, and found she meant it. "I would have suspected me too. You could have told me the day the bond snapped," Corvin said, finding her in the garden weeks later, the fire no longer something she had to hide at all, curling lazy and unhurried around her fingers in the open afternoon light. "I was so certain being seen was the most dangerous thing that could happen to me," Wren said. 3 years taught me that lesson very thoroughly. I never once imagined being seen would be the thing that finally saved me instead." He took her hand, and this time when the warmth rose between her fingers, gold and steady, he laced his own fingers through it and let it burn there against his skin, unafraid, the way he had never once flinched from any part of her from the very first moment their hands had touched in that library. "Broken Wren," he said softly, testing the old cruel name one final time and setting it down for good, "the way you set down a weight you've carried so long you'd nearly forgotten it wasn't your own. I think I'll call you something else from now on." "And what's that, Your Majesty?" "Mine," he said, "if you'll still have me, knowing I let an old law and my own slowness to ask the right questions nearly cost me the best thing I ever bought for 11 copper coins." "You bought a broken Omega," Wren said, and let herself smile, truly and without fear, for what she realized was the first time in 3 long years. "You're going to have to settle for a firewolf instead." "I find," Corvin said, drawing her closer, "that I can live with the trade." And in the firelight of her own making, at long last seen, and entirely unafraid of it, so could she. Thanks for listening to this one. What do you think? Should Corvin have believed her the night the bond first snapped, instead of letting it take a courtroom and an old law to force the truth out into the open? Let me know in the comments. Until the next confession, Duke Ashvale.